I can still remember the sharp bite of that morning air as I made the decision to walk into a life that felt far larger than I was ready for. I'd barely slept, just paced my cramped apartment all night, caught between hope and dread, wondering if this was the turning point, or the moment everything would unravel. My phone conversation with Jonathan Reeves had been short, almost businesslike. 3 months. No days off. You'll live on-site and care for my daughter full-time. We'll take care of the rest. His voice was deep, calm, almost too calm. But behind it, I could sense something heavier. The kind of burden that no amount of money could erase. The salary he offered wasn't just generous, it was life-changing. For someone like me, it wasn't a job offer. It was a lifeline. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 29. A licensed child therapist specializing in autism spectrum disorders. Sounds impressive, right? On paper, maybe. But my life had rarely felt stable or secure. I'm so glad you're here. Follow my journey to the very end, and let me know which city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. I grew up in foster care, bounced from home to home after my parents died in a car crash when I was 9. Birthdays were just calendar days. Trust was a skill you learned to live without. I figured out early on that the only person who'd stick around for me was me. I buried myself in academics, books, psychology, trying to make sense of why people hurt and how they heal. I graduated top of my class from Boston University. Not because it was easy, but because I needed to prove, mostly to myself, that I wouldn't be another forgotten foster kid lost in the system. But life tests people like me. My first job ended when my supervisor's accidental touches became too frequent, and when I spoke up, I was labeled overly sensitive. The second ended in scandal, a false accusation of stealing meds from a clinic's supply closet. In healthcare, rumors move faster than truth. The third, that one just broke me. 12-hour shifts, constant aggression, panic attacks I couldn't push down anymore. I burned out. Quietly. Completely. Somewhere along the line, I stopped caring how I looked. No makeup. No fitted clothes. No effort. It was easier to fade into the background, to not invite questions, assumptions, or attention I didn't ask for. Most people don't realize how draining it is to be sized up the moment you walk into a room. So I hid behind oversized sweaters, tied back hair, and fake prescription glasses. Then came the call. Jonathan Reeves, a name I barely recognized from financial news segments. A widower. A man who built his fortune in high-risk investments. I remember clutching the phone so tightly my fingers hurt as he explained the job. Caring for Sophie, his 16-year-old daughter with a rare autoimmune disease and Asperger's. He needed someone who understood both the physical and emotional weight of chronic conditions. Someone who wouldn't panic at silence or explosive emotions. Why me? I asked, low and unsure. After so many rejections, I couldn't believe anyone would actually choose me. There was a pause. A long breath. Then he said, "Your former professor recommended you. Said you care. Said you don't walk away when things get hard. That's exactly what Sophie needs." That stayed with me. You don't walk away when things get hard. It had been so long since anyone had seen something in me worth believing in. For a moment, I felt a lump in my throat. But I swallowed it, like I always did, and answered simply, "I'll do it." The next few days flew by in a haze of hurried plans. I packed my life into a single suitcase, some jeans, cozy sweaters, and my worn-down winter boots. Vermont in late fall wasn't exactly forgiving. I'd looked up the Reeves estate on satellite maps, perched on a hill, surrounded by woods, far from everything. The kind of place that would scare most people, but to someone like me, it whispered of quiet and space to finally breathe. Still, the night before leaving, doubts crept in like cold air under a door. What if I mess this up? What if Sophie hates me? What if this ends like everything else has? And underneath all of that, the quietest thought. What if I fail again? But failure or not, I didn't have many options. My bank account was almost empty. The world hadn't offered many second chances. So I zipped up my suitcase, gave one last glance at the tiny apartment I was leaving behind, the peeling wallpaper, the muffled sounds of city traffic, and told myself, this isn't running away. This is running toward something. The next morning, right at 8 o'clock, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man in his mid-30s stepped out with a calm smile. "Claire Donovan?" he asked. "I'm Jason Miller. I'll be your driver today." His voice was warm, disarmingly so. The kind of effortless friendliness that caught me off guard. People didn't usually look at me like that, much less smile. I handed him my lone suitcase, slid into the back seat of the SUV, and watched in silence as the city gave way to winding highways and dense lines of trees. For 3 hours, we drove north. The gray blocks of urban sprawl faded into sweeping hills touched with the last golds of autumn, and then into woods slowly shedding their leaves in preparation for winter's arrival. By the time we turned onto a long, private drive flanked by tall maples, their branches mostly bare but still holding on to a few stubborn amber leaves, it felt like I had crossed into an entirely different world. One suspended in stillness, like a moment caught between heartbeats. And maybe I was holding my breath, because this wasn't just a job. It was a reset. A shot at starting over. At finally standing still long enough to see what a new beginning might look like. Maybe even, finding something that felt like home. Jonathan Reeves was waiting on the front steps when we arrived. I hadn't expected him to be there. In my mind, someone like him, wealthy, powerful, probably buried in corporate meetings, would have sent a staff member. A personal assistant. A property manager. But instead, there he stood. Tall. Broad-shouldered. The silver at his temples giving him the kind of distinguished look magazines fawn over. But it was his eyes I noticed first, eyes that held a kind of quiet sorrow I recognized instantly. The kind that comes from loving someone you're terrified of losing. "Ms. Donovan," he said with a calm nod. His voice was steady, low, but his gaze didn't waver. It searched, like he was trying to read everything about me in the space of a breath. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." I stepped out, gripping my bag tighter than necessary. Like it could shield me. "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied, surprised at how steady I sounded despite the anxious knot tightening in my chest. This wasn't an interview. This wasn't something I could just walk away from. It was 3 months of commitment, no exit plan, no backup. Jonathan gestured toward the front door. "We can talk in my study. Maggie will show you your room afterward." Inside, the house was exactly what I imagined, and nothing like I expected. Grand, yes. Impeccably maintained. Vaulted ceilings, polished wood floors, a kind of understated elegance. But it wasn't cold. It wasn't impersonal like most places I'd seen with money behind them. The walls held framed photographs, not staged portraits, but genuine moments. A younger Jonathan cradling a newborn wrapped in pink. An older boy with his arms around a little girl. A woman, smiling so warmly it was almost painful to look at. His late wife, I assumed. I didn't ask. Some grief wears itself plainly, this was one of those. His study felt more lived in than I would have guessed, bookshelves filled to the brim, a low fire crackling in the hearth, and the faint smell of coffee in the air. He motioned to a chair across from him and sat, hands clasped, posture serious but not stiff. "I want to be upfront about what this job involves," he began. "Sophie is 16. She has a rare autoimmune condition, it leaves her exhausted, weak. On top of that, she's on the autism spectrum. High functioning, but extremely withdrawn. She struggles with connection. Honestly, she hasn't connected with anyone in a long time." His eyes flicked briefly to a photo on the desk. Blonde hair, solemn expression. "Sophie. You're not here to fix her. That's not the goal. You're here to be a presence. Someone who can offer consistency. And if we're lucky, moments of joy. He paused then, jaw tightening slightly. We don't get many of those anymore. I nodded slowly, listening. What about her schooling? Any friends? I asked gently. She's homeschooled, he replied. Mostly online tutors. She stopped trying with peers years ago. I think she gave up. And I. He looked toward the fire, his voice faltering. I don't know how to reach her anymore. I let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. I've worked with kids on the spectrum before, I said quietly. I can't promise miracles, Mr. Reeves. But I can promise I'll try. That brought his eyes back to mine. That's all I'm asking, effort and presence, he said. Which brings us to the terms. You'll live on the property full time. No weekends off for the first 3 months unless there's an emergency. She needs someone who doesn't disappear. There was a beat before he added, the compensation will reflect the commitment. You'll be paid 5 times the average rate for live-in therapy. 5 times? I repeated, my breath catching. That was more than I had ever made in a single year. That's generous, I managed, forcing my tone to stay even. But inside, my thoughts were already spinning. That kind of money could erase my debt. Give me space to breathe. Maybe, for the first time, I could stop scrambling just to survive, and start thinking about what I actually wanted from my life. Jonathan leaned in slightly. This isn't about being generous, Ms. Donovan. It's about Sophie. She's my entire world, and I won't apologize for wanting the best for her. There was no arrogance in his voice, only a worn-out kind of honesty. A sincerity that rang clear and heavy. I'd seen that look before, on foster parents who truly gave a damn, who lived in quiet fear that they weren't enough. Only Jonathan had the resources to be enough, and he was determined to use them. I cleared my throat, gathering myself. I forced the more grounded questions to the surface, her medical schedule, known allergies, behavioral triggers, who to call in an emergency. He answered everything with practiced precision. This was clearly a man used to high-stakes situations. Organized, efficient, intimidating, even, but beneath all that, I caught glimpses of something softer. A man trying, desperately, to keep something precious from slipping through his fingers. When we'd gone through it all, he stood and held out his hand. Do we have an agreement? I paused only long enough to draw a breath. Yes, I said. We do. He gave a single nod, like a tightly held breath being let out. Maggie will take you to your room. Dinner's at 6. I'll introduce you to Sophie afterward. Just like that, it was official. As I followed Maggie, a brisk, red-haired woman with a no-nonsense air and a warmth that settled you without asking permission, through the long corridors of the estate, the weight of it all began to settle. 3 months, no breaks. No backing out. But also, a real chance. A chance to rebuild myself. And maybe, just maybe, help a girl who had closed herself off the same way I once had. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel scared. I felt useful. Anchored. Like I had a reason to stay. The room Maggie brought me to nearly stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't showy or extravagant. Not in the way people assume a millionaire's home would be. No gold finishes or soulless marble floors. Instead, it felt lived in. Real. The bed was made with a hand-stitched quilt, the kind of heirloom you'd find folded away in your grandmother's closet. A wide window framed a view of the forest outside, painted in shades of red and amber, the late autumn sun trickling through the trees like warm syrup. Maggie set my suitcase on the bed and gave me a kind smile. I'm Maggie O'Connor. Been with the family nearly 30 years. Raised my boy right here in this house. Her voice had that lyrical Irish cadence, gentle, steady, like someone who had weathered storms and come through stronger. If you need anything, anything at all, just come find me. I returned the smile, some of the tension leaving my shoulders. Thank you. It's beautiful here. She nodded. It is. Quiet too, you'll get used to it. Supper's at 6 sharp. The boss doesn't go in for late meals. She winked before slipping out, leaving me alone in the soft hush of the room. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window, letting my breath go slowly. The silence here wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. And peace was something I didn't trust easily. It never lasted. But for now, I let myself feel it. Dinner that evening introduced me to the rest of the household. The dining room was large but inviting. A long oak table ran down the center, polished but not overly formal. Linen napkins, fresh-cut flowers in a ceramic vase. It wasn't designed to impress, it was meant to be lived around. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, still every bit the executive in a crisp shirt, though he softened visibly when Maggie set down a steaming platter of roasted chicken in front of him. To his right sat a striking young woman, dark, glossy hair, tailored dress that aimed for professional but landed somewhere closer to elegant. "This is Brittany," Jonathan said, tone neutral, as if he knew exactly how her presence might be received. "She manages the upstairs rooms and handles some of Sophie's laundry." Brittany turned toward me with a smile that looked perfect on the surface but carried an edge. "So you're the new caretaker?" Her voice was honeyed but sharp, like sweetness that stings. "Welcome." "Thank you," I said, mirroring her tone with cautious politeness. She held my eyes just a second too long, then turned away without another word. Across from her sat a man built for the outdoors, strong frame, weathered hands, sun-browned skin. "Ryan O'Connor," he said with a nod, voice low and edged with the same Irish lilt as Maggie's. "I handle the grounds and maintenance." Maggie herself sat beside me, cheerful and talkative. She filled the space with stories, how Jonathan's late wife loved to plant tulips every spring, how Sophie used to toddle through the garden before her illness set in. Her words added depth to the place, history, like memory lived in every room. Jason, the driver who'd picked me up, joined us partway through, bringing an easy smile and a laugh that lightened the room. What struck me most was how everyone ate together. This wasn't a household where the staff were ghosts. They weren't ignored or tucked away. Jonathan asked about the repairs Ryan had done on the greenhouse, about Jason's upcoming trip into Burlington, and even inquired how Maggie's latest baking experiment turned out. There was no pretense. No hierarchy. Just people. Maybe even something close to a family. And yet, I noticed Brittany watching Jonathan. Not glancing. Watching, like she was waiting for him to look back. He didn't. If he noticed, he didn't show it. His focus was on me, asking about my qualifications, my time working with kids on the spectrum, and whether I'd ever taken a live-in role before. When the meal ended, Jonathan stood. "Claire," he said, "I'd like you to meet Sophie now. That is, if you're not too tired." I wasn't. And even if I had been, I wouldn't have said so. We walked down a quiet hallway lined with bookcases and old photos. I paused in front of one, a younger Sophie, probably 2 or 3, tangled blonde curls and wide blue eyes clutching a stuffed giraffe. There was something radiant in that photo, something untouched. A little girl full of life. Jonathan knocked gently on a door, then opened it. "Sophie, I want you to meet someone." The room was dim. Curtains drawn. A faint scent of antiseptic mixed with lavender hung in the air. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, her shoulders narrow and hunched, fingers wound tightly in the hem of her sweater. She didn't lift her head. "Sophie," Jonathan said softly. "This is Claire. She'll be staying with us for a while to help out." The only acknowledgement was a faint dip of her chin, if that. Jonathan glanced at me, his expression apologetic, then turned back to her. "Claire's here to support you. Just like Maggie does. All right?" Another subtle nod. Almost imperceptible. He placed a light hand on my arm, guiding me gently into the hallway. "Don't take it to heart," he said quietly once the door was closed behind us. "She struggles to connect. It's part of everything she's up against." "I understand," I murmured. And I did. Kids like Sophie didn't withdraw out of defiance. They pulled away because the world had already pushed them too far. That night, lying in bed with the low hum of the heating system filling the silence, I couldn't stop thinking about her, Sophie, with her pale, guarded expression and those almost nods. I thought about Jonathan too, carrying a burden so heavy he seemed to move through the day without fully breathing. And I thought about myself, why I'd said yes so fast, why I'd packed my entire life into a suitcase for a job that could easily break me. But somewhere inside, faint as a whisper, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, Jonathan asked to speak with me before I began my day with Sophie. He was already in his study when I arrived, leaning casually against the edge of his desk, fingers loosely laced in front of him. The light streaming through the tall windows caught the angles of his face, making the lines around his eyes seem deeper, more worn. "Claire," he said, motioning to a chair. "Before you dive in, there's something I need to share. Not the clinical version, the real story." I nodded and folded my hands, preparing myself for the kind of truth that doesn't come with tidy resolutions. "She was our miracle," he began quietly. "Catherine, my wife, and I tried for years to have another child. We already had Daniel, but she dreamed of having a daughter." His voice caught slightly. "When she finally got pregnant, it should have been a joyful time. But it wasn't." He paused, jaw tightening. "Catherine had a heart condition. The pregnancy made it worse. But she wouldn't consider ending it. She was determined to have Sophie. Said she'd fight for her, no matter the cost." His voice dropped. "She gave birth, and never came home. Her heart gave out. A week after Sophie was born, I buried my wife." The stillness that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock out in the hall like it was in the room with us. I wanted to say something, but nothing came. "Sophie's always been delicate," he continued. "Eventually, the doctors told us she had a rare autoimmune disorder. Her immune system attacks itself. Even a minor cold can knock her down hard." He paused, looking out the window where frost clung to the trees like lace. "As she grew, we noticed more. She wouldn't make eye contact. Didn't respond to her name. By 3, they diagnosed her with Asperger's. She's highly intelligent in some areas, but the world overwhelms her. Everything is too much." He turned slightly, still watching the trees. "For a while, we managed. She responded to structure, to consistent therapy. There were even moments she laughed. But then puberty hit, and everything unraveled. Her health deteriorated. She barely speaks now. I haven't seen her smile in over 2 years. And honestly, I feel like I'm losing her. Little by little. Every single day." There was so much weight in those words it felt like gravity shifted in the room. My chest ached just hearing them. "Jonathan," I said gently, "I can't promise to fix any of that. I don't have a miracle to offer." He turned to face me, meeting my eyes. "I'm not asking for miracles. I just want someone who won't give up on her. Someone who can give her a reason, any reason, to stay connected to something, or someone." His hands clenched, then slowly released. "We've tried everything. You're the last person I'm bringing in before." He stopped himself, his voice trailing into silence. But I understood what he meant. "Before giving up hope." "What about school?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation toward practical ground. "Does she have friends?" He shook his head. "We pulled her out 2 years ago. Too many illnesses, too many meltdowns. She's been doing online tutoring since. As for friends, she hasn't had one since she was 8. There was one girl who tried, but Sophie couldn't keep up with the back and forth. Eventually, the girl just stopped coming." He let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for months. "Kids don't mean to be cruel. But sometimes they are. And I can't be everything. I can't be her dad and her therapist. She needs someone steady. Someone who won't shut down just because she does. I pictured Sophie's room again, the drawn curtains, the smell of lavender and antiseptic, the way she gripped her sweater like it was armor. I thought of the quiet nod she gave me, and the photo in the hall of a little girl smiling at a toy giraffe like she trusted the world. "I can be steady," I said quietly. "That much, I can promise." Jonathan's shoulders eased slightly. Something softened in his face, maybe relief, or something close to it. "Thank you," he said. "Just be patient. She might try to push you away. She pushes everyone away." "I know the feeling," I said, before I could catch myself. He gave me a look then, not judgmental, but curious. He didn't press. Instead, he handed me a binder. Thick. Worn. Stuffed with papers and notes. Sophie's routine. Medication schedule. Therapy history. "Read it when you get the chance." "One more thing," Jonathan added, his voice quieter now. "Sophie's never really formed a bond with anyone outside the family. If she does, even a little. Please tell me. That would mean more than you can imagine." I stood up, pressing the binder tightly against my chest. "I'll do everything I can," I said. He gave a single nod. "That's all I'm asking." As I left his study, I paused in the hallway and leaned against the wall, the weight of it all settling over me. This wasn't just a job. It was a last, fragile hope wrapped in the quiet suffering of a man and the isolated world of a girl. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a small shift in myself, as if something long buried inside me stirred and whispered, "Don't fail them." The morning I officially started felt heavier than I expected. The house itself was calm, warm wood, faint traces of coffee and lemon oil in the air, but the quiet carried Jonathan's story like an echo. I wasn't just here to assist. I was stepping into a life already stretched thin, where even a small misstep could send a girl further inward. I knocked softly on Sophie's door, then eased it open just a crack. "Good morning, Sophie. May I come in?" My voice was low and careful, the kind you'd use if a bird had landed on your palm and you didn't dare breathe too loud. She was perched on the edge of her bed again, legs tucked beneath her, hugging a pillow close. Her hair hung over her face as she stared at the floor. "I thought maybe we could have breakfast together," I said, stepping in a little further. "You don't have to talk. Just join me if you feel like it." There was no answer. Just silence, the kind that settles like fog, heavy and still. But I didn't leave. I lowered myself to the floor, keeping my distance, and began to speak. Little things. The frost lining the windows. The cinnamon in Maggie's scones. How my old apartment never knew mornings as quiet as this. She didn't move for 20 minutes. Then, without a word or glance, she stood up, walked past me, and headed for the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Breakfast was subdued. Jonathan kissed the top of Sophie's head as she sat down, but she didn't react. Maggie served us, giving me a kind but knowing look that said, "Don't worry. This is normal." Brittany walked in moments later, sharp and put together even in her uniform. She sipped her coffee and glanced at me over the rim of her mug. "So," she said, her tone sugary but a touch too pointed, "how's your first day going?" I smiled faintly. "It's just getting started." She tilted her head slightly, eyes assessing me like someone measuring a potential threat. "You'll see," she said. "Sophie's particular. Not everyone lasts around here." Jonathan's eyes flicked toward her, a quiet warning, but she just shrugged and left the room. The tension she left behind lingered in the air like static. After breakfast, I followed Sophie back to her room, giving her space. She curled up in the window seat, knees drawn to her chest, her gaze fixed on the trees outside. "It's a nice view, isn't it?" I said gently. "I like it too. I used to live in the city, concrete, sirens, always something buzzing. This is quieter. It feels like your thoughts have room here." She didn't reply. But I kept speaking, not to fill the silence, but to make the sound of my voice something she could grow used to. In the days that followed, I built a rhythm. I read aloud while she sketched silently in her notebook. I hummed while straightening her space, letting a bit more sunlight in each morning. Some days she left the room when I entered. Other times she stayed, quiet but present, and in this work, presence meant progress. Evenings were harder. Her condition wore her down by late afternoon. Fatigue made her irritable. Sometimes the exhaustion came with tears she couldn't name. When it did, I sat with her, calm and unshaken, reminding myself that emotions weren't problems to solve. They were keys, if you stayed long enough to find the lock. Jonathan observed quietly most nights, his face unreadable. But once, as I passed him in the hallway, he murmured, "You're patient. That matters." It was the closest thing to praise I'd heard from him. But not everything was smooth. Brittany remained a constant source of friction. She never said anything outright, but her glances were sharp, calculated, like she was waiting for me to falter. One evening, in front of Sophie, she casually mentioned that most caretakers didn't last more than a month. I saw Sophie stiffen instantly, her fingers tightening around her blanket. And something inside me snapped. It wasn't anger exactly, more like a quiet resolve to prove Brittany wrong. The hardest moment came on day 5. I'd brought a small box of paints with me, hoping to spark Sophie's interest. At first, she didn't even glance in my direction. But when I gently placed the box near her chair, she reacted. Not violently, but fast enough to knock the paints to the floor. Her breathing turned rapid, bordering on panic. I froze, then crouched down to her level. "It's okay, Sophie," I said softly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I'll put them away." For a second, I thought she might yell. Instead, she folded into herself, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't change things." Something inside me clenched. "Okay," I replied in the same hushed tone. "No changes. Not unless you say it's okay." It took nearly 30 minutes, but eventually, she loosened her posture just enough for me to gather the paints and return them to the box, lid closed tight. She watched me the whole time, then gave a tiny nod, so small I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking. That night, exhaustion seeped into every part of me. Lying in bed, I thought about the road ahead. People outside this line of work often imagine progress as sudden revelations or dramatic change. But real progress lives in the smallest places: a quiet breakfast, a hesitant glance, a whispered plea not to disturb the fragile order of things. And I knew then, with more certainty than ever, that I wasn't going anywhere. Not because of Brittany. Not because of fear. Not even because of my own doubts. I stayed because Sophie needed someone who would. And, for the first time in years, I wanted to be that person. By the second week, I could feel her defenses, not just see them, but sense them like tension in the air. Invisible walls, carefully built over time, keeping the world out. She spoke rarely, avoided eye contact. But she listened, I could tell. Whenever I told little stories, about growing up in foster homes, about what it felt like to be the odd one out, her movements would still. Her breath would ease. It wasn't much, but I'd been doing this long enough to recognize what listening looked like, even when words stayed locked away. Still, something was missing. Connection needs an anchor. And sometimes, when words fall short, that anchor has to be something else entirely. One evening, while Jonathan and I sat in the kitchen going over notes, I looked up and said, "Have you ever considered a therapy dog? Something to help her regulate emotions. A companion who doesn't expect conversation." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A dog? We've never had pets." "I'm not sure how she'd handle the unpredictability." "That's the thing," I said with a small smile. Therapy dogs are trained for predictability. For calm. I know someone at a rescue who works with Newfoundlands. They're massive, but gentle. Like breathing teddy bears. He was quiet for a moment, weighing it. "If you think it's worth a shot, go ahead. Just, take it slow." Don't push her. The next morning, I called an old colleague. By Friday, we had a visitor, a 2-year-old Newfoundland named Timothy, or just Tim. He was massive, all black fur that shimmered like ink, with eyes that didn't so much look at you as take you in. When I led him into Sophie's room, she froze. Her eyes flicked between me and Tim, unsure. "He's friendly," I said softly. "Do you want me to take him back?" For a moment, I braced myself for another outburst like the one with the paints. But she whispered something I almost missed. "He can stay." Tim stepped forward, one slow, quiet movement at a time, until he was sitting directly in front of her. No barking, no licking, no insistence. Just presence. Sophie's hands hovered above his fur, trembling. Then, slowly, she touched him. Just once. Then again, for longer. Her eyes met mine briefly, flickering with something not quite joy, but maybe curiosity. In the days that followed, Tim became part of our rhythm. He curled up beside Sophie while she drew, padded after her into the kitchen, slept at the foot of her bed each night. And in return, Sophie changed, just a little, but enough to make my chest ache with something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She began whispering to him when she thought no one else could hear. Soft words like "good boy" and "stay." One morning, I found her seated on the rug, legs crossed, brushing Tim's coat with total focus. She didn't even notice I was watching. When she finally did look up, she said quietly, "He likes it." I almost didn't respond, stunned by the full sentence. "He does," I said with a smile. "And he likes you." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, before she returned to brushing. That evening, Jonathan stopped me in the hall, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me about Tim," he said. "She hasn't shared something with me like that in years." "Thank you, Claire." I shook my head. "He's the one doing the work." But deep down, I knew this was a turning point. One small step toward something better. It wasn't just about Sophie anymore, it was about me, too. For the first time, I felt like maybe I belonged. Tim's arrival didn't only shift Sophie's world, it altered the atmosphere of the entire house. She still didn't smile much, and her words were rare, but she began trailing after Tim into places she'd once avoided: the kitchen, the greenhouse, even the back porch when the weather allowed. I could see it in Jonathan's face every time she wandered into a new space. There was hesitation in his eyes, like hope was something he didn't dare feel, but couldn't quite stop from creeping in. And somewhere in the midst of it, I began to change too. I lingered longer after dinner, listening to Maggie hum old Irish lullabies as she rinsed dishes. I joined Jason for his morning coffee runs when I had 10 spare minutes. Even Ryan, quiet, steady Ryan, started stopping by to check on Tim, though I had a feeling he was checking on me, too. One afternoon, as I sat on the back steps watching Sophie toss a ball gently for Tim, Ryan leaned on the porch railing beside me. "She's different with him," he said quietly. I nodded. "She's different with everything lately. Tim's become a kind of bridge." Ryan gave a small smile, the kind that warmed you. "You're part of that, too. Don't forget it." I looked down at my hands, uneasy with the compliment. "I'm just trying not to mess it up." "You're doing more than that," he said. After a pause, he added, "Do you like it here?" The question caught me by surprise. "Yeah," I said after a beat. "More than I expected." His gaze softened, and something in his expression made my chest tighten. There was no judgment. No expectation. Just quiet understanding. For someone like me, someone who'd spent years behind invisible walls, that kind of grace felt rare. And healing. A week later, my best friend back in Boston invited me to her farewell party. She was moving to Seattle. I didn't plan on going, but Jonathan caught me in the hallway and said, "You should go. We'll be fine for a day. You've earned it." So I went. The first time I'd left in weeks. The city greeted me like a punch of noise and motion, but I felt strangely distant from it. I didn't miss it, not the way I thought I would. What I wasn't expecting was to run into him. Vlad. The man I once called my boyfriend. The one who turned my trust into a joke for his friends. He spotted me across the room, and that crooked grin spread across his face, the kind that used to make my stomach drop. "Well, if it isn't Claire Donovan," he said. "Heard you finally disappeared." "Figures." I stiffened, ready to walk away, but he stepped in front of me. "Still trying to save broken things?" he sneered. "Who's the project this time?" Old shame surged, hot and bitter. I couldn't move. And then, from behind me, a voice cut through. "Back off." It was Ryan. I didn't even know he was in the city. Later, he told me he'd had a supply run nearby. But in that moment, all I could feel was relief. Vlad muttered something under his breath and stalked off, deciding Ryan wasn't worth the effort. "You okay?" Ryan asked, gentle and steady. I nodded, even though my throat felt tight. "Yeah, just some ghosts I wasn't ready for." He looked at me, long and serious. "You don't owe them anything. Especially not your silence." And something about those words, pierced through a fear I'd carried for far too long. "Thank you," I whispered. We didn't speak about it again that night. He didn't ask for details. He just stayed nearby, quiet and reassuring, the kind of presence you don't realize you've been missing until it's there. When we returned to Vermont the next day, the sky hung low, soft gray, and full of snowlight. Winter in Vermont doesn't scream its arrival, it drifts in, silent and slow, like the world is exhaling. As we walked up the path to the house, I noticed her. Sophie. Waiting by the door, Tim beside her like a shadow. "You came back," she said, her eyes on the ground but her voice clear. I smiled. "I told you I would." Her lips moved, tentative, like they weren't sure how to shape the feeling. And then, it happened. A smile. Small. Fragile. Fleeting. But real. Jonathan, standing just behind her, froze in the doorway. His hand gripped the frame like he needed it to hold him steady. No one spoke for a beat. Then from the kitchen, Maggie's soft voice floated out. "Well, I'll be." Just like that, something shifted. It wasn't healing. Not all of it. Not yet. But it was the start. That evening, the house felt different. Sophie didn't vanish into her room like usual. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, sketchpad open, Tim curled at her feet. Maggie stirred soup at the stove. The room was full of warmth and quiet. Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching her. Hands in his pockets. His face unreadable, hope, fear, something tangled in between. He turned to me. "What happened out there?" "Nothing big," I replied softly. "I just came back. Like I said I would." He let out a long breath and nodded slowly. "Sometimes, that's all it takes." And from that point on, the days felt different. Sophie still had her difficult days, quiet stretches where she barely spoke, and long afternoons where exhaustion clung to her like mist. But something had shifted. She started seeking me out, even if only to share the same space in silence. Sometimes she asked simple things, how Tim liked his food, or how the snowplows handled the steep driveway. Once, out of nowhere, she asked what my favorite color was. When I told her it was green, she later handed me a drawing, maple leaves, each one carefully shaded in rich, dark emerald tones. Jonathan noticed, too. One evening after Sophie had gone to bed, he glanced over at me and said, almost in a whisper, "You've done more in 3 weeks than I have in 3 years." I shook my head. "It's not me. It's just patience. And trust." He smiled faintly and added, "And Tim, of course." Then, after a beat, he rubbed the back of his neck and said, "My wife used to say something that's been echoing in my mind lately. She'd say, people aren't puzzles to solve. They're gardens. You have to tend them. I think you've been doing that here." His words lingered with me, mostly because I had never seen myself as someone who nurtured anything. My life had always been about surviving, fixing cracks as they appeared, patching wounds and moving on. But maybe, just maybe, I was beginning to plant something of my own. After that night in Boston, Ryan and I grew closer in the quiet, easy way that doesn't need to be defined. We didn't bring up Vlad, didn't rehash what had happened. It wasn't necessary. He just began showing up more often, helping Maggie fix a leaky tap, adjusting Tim's new kennel, or simply sitting on the porch beside me with a cup of coffee in hand. We'd sit there in companionable silence, the cold biting our skin, and in that stillness, I felt something rare, safe. Then one evening, Sophie surprised us both. She came out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket, with Tim's giant head resting gently in her lap. She didn't say anything at first, just watched the snow drift through the fading light. And then, in a quiet voice, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" Her words pierced through me, because yes, that had been my whole life. I used to, I admitted. All the time. Like I was always standing just outside the doorway, looking in. She turned to look at me, her gaze sharper than usual. What changed? I exhaled slowly. I found people who didn't expect me to earn a place. They just let me in. Even when I didn't think I deserved it. Sophie was quiet for a long time. Then, just above a whisper, she said, "I want that." "You already have it," I told her gently, leaning forward. "Here. Now. With your dad, with Maggie, with Ryan and Tim. And with me. None of us are going anywhere." Her hand curled into Tim's fur, and then, for the second time that week, she smiled. It was soft but real, and this time it reached her eyes. Jonathan had come out onto the porch at some point and was standing behind us. When he saw her smile, he turned away quickly, blinking hard. Later that night, Jonathan found me in the hallway. "You've given her something I didn't think we'd ever get back," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Hope?" I asked softly. He nodded. I hesitated. Hope wasn't something I'd ever thought of myself as offering. "She's the one choosing it," I said. "I'm just making space for her to find it." Jonathan paused, then said something that caught me off guard. "Claire, when these 3 months are up, if you'd like to stay longer, there'll always be room for you here." The words hit harder than I expected. I'd spent my whole life in temporary places, short leases, unstable jobs, relationships with expiration dates. And now someone was offering me something lasting. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Sophie's smile, Jonathan's offer, and the steady comfort of Ryan's presence. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I had stopped. Like I'd arrived. By the time December came, everything outside was wrapped in white. Vermont winters have a way of quieting the world, slowing time down until you're left holding only what truly matters. And for me, that was Sophie. This house. And the quiet, unfamiliar certainty that I wasn't just passing through anymore, I belonged. The Reeves home glowed that winter. Not because of glitter or garlands, though Maggie did hang a wreath on the door and set up a modest tree, but because there was life again. Sophie emerged from her room more and more, always with her sketchpad in hand and Tim faithfully trailing behind her. She even started leaving little handwritten notes on the kitchen counter. "Thanks for the soup, Maggie. Tim needs a new brush, Claire." They were small things, but Jonathan saved every single one, tucking them away in a drawer like they were gold. On Christmas Eve, Jonathan asked me to join them for dinner. "It's usually just the 4 of us, me, Sophie, Maggie, and Ryan," he said. "But you're part of us now. Part of us now." The words landed deep. Dinner was simple and warm. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, Maggie's famous apple pie. Ryan sat across from me, offering his quiet, familiar smile every time our eyes met. Jonathan poured wine into 4 glasses and lifted his. "To family," he said. "The ones we're born into, and the ones we choose." I caught Sophie glancing at me just then, her voice so soft it was almost missed. To family. Jonathan froze mid-sip. His eyes shimmered, and I realized it might have been the first time she ever joined a toast. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Snow was falling again, thick and silent, and the fireplace crackled low. Sophie sat on the rug, Tim curled around her like a blanket. Then, without saying a word, she stood and walked toward me, something tucked behind her back. "This is for you," she said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a drawing. It was me, sitting by her window, reading. Tim was stretched out at my feet. And in the corner of the room, her own figure watched quietly, a pencil in hand. Across the bottom, in careful script, she'd written, "Thanks for staying." I couldn't find words. My throat tightened, and my eyes burned. I reached out and pulled her gently into a hug. She stiffened at first, then slowly, gradually, melted into it. Jonathan turned toward the fireplace, pretending to adjust the logs. But I saw him swipe a hand across his cheek. Later that night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at me and whispered, "You'll still be here after, right?" I squeezed her hand and said, "Yes. I will. As long as you want me to." Her small hand wrapped tightly around mine. "Okay." And then, for the third time in just a few weeks, she smiled. Later that night, once the house had settled into quiet, Jonathan found me in the kitchen. His voice was low, calm, but weighted. "You've done something I wasn't sure was possible," he said. "You brought my daughter back to me." I shook my head gently. "She did that herself. I just stayed." He looked at me for a long moment before saying, quieter still, "That's exactly what she needed. Someone who didn't walk away." We stood there in the stillness, listening to the wind thrash against the windows, and then he said something I hadn't expected. "Claire, what I said earlier, I meant it. If you want to stay after your contract ends, this house is your home, too. For good." That word, home, landed harder than I anticipated. I'd never really had one. Not one that lasted. I thought of Sophie's drawing, of Ryan's quiet steadiness, of Maggie's laughter while she stirred soup and Jason's effortless jokes that filled the kitchen with warmth. And for the first time in my life, staying didn't feel like a trap. It felt like belonging. I nodded, slow but certain. "I'd like that. I want to stay." Jonathan smiled then, a real one, the kind that softened him, made him look years younger. "Good," he said. "I'm glad." As I made my way back to my room, I passed Sophie's doorway. She was already asleep, Tim curled protectively at her feet. Her lips were tilted into the faintest smile, and something settled in me, something I hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Peace. Not the kind that feels delicate, like it might disappear with the next wrong step, but the deep, steady kind. The kind that comes when you finally stop running. Because healing doesn't always come with sweeping change or dramatic turns. Sometimes it looks like showing up. Like choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. Like holding someone's hand when everyone else lets go. That winter, in a house perched on a quiet hill in Vermont, surrounded by snow, silence, and unexpected joy, I found something I didn't know I'd been searching for. A place. A family. A home. And in that still moment, I knew I wasn't just helping Sophie find her way back. She was helping me find mine, too.